Hello to all. I am thrilled to be here again at Beit lecturing to you about the field I love to study, the field I love to teach, the field I love to read about, even at midnight, Judeo-Arabic literature and civilization. In the 3 lectures that are part of this series, we'll focus on 3 different aspects of Judeo-Arabic literature and civilization. In this first meeting, I will devote myself to scholarship, to Judeo-Arabic in its written form, the revolution in which Jews began to write about Judaism in Arabic, focusing on the figure of Adia Gaon. In the second lecture of this series, I'll be speaking about daily life. Jews, Arabic-speaking Jews, who were the majority of Jews during the medieval period that we're focusing on, and their lives as reflected in documentary materials from the Cairo Genizot. And in the third lecture of this series, we'll focus on the transitions that occurred later on between Judeo-Arabic and Hebrew, focusing on linguistic questions, which have fascinated me and which were one of the reasons I actually entered this field. So let us begin. You are looking at a folio from a manuscript which was completed in the early 1000s. This is the Tafsir of Rabbi Sa, from the title of this lecture. Who was Sa'adia? He was a scholar and a leader born in the year 862. The Gaon in his name refers to the fact that he was one of the heads of the Babylonian yeshiva of Sura. He was born in Egypt. He traveled in the land of Israel and then ended up in Baghdad, which is where he entered the ranks of the leadership and the Babylonian yeshivot. Sa'adia was prolific in a variety of fields. You will see many, if not all of those fields in the next minutes as we learn together. And you're looking at his Tafsir, probably the work for which he is most famous. Tafsir in Arabic means translation. This is Sa'adia's Judeo-Arabic translation of the Torah. And we're going to talk more about the term Judeo-Arabic in brief later on, but it's Arabic as written by Jews. As you can see on the screen, the Hebrew verses are written in a monumental square script. You can see that along the top and bottom, and even the sides of the page, there is the Masorah Gdolah, the Masorah, the tradition of documenting phenomena in the biblical text, was just developing in the period of Sa'adia's life. And this is recorded in this manuscript. And then you see a Judeo-Arabic translation in between the verses. And this is Sa'adia's original translation. Hebrew script, Arabic language. We'll do a deeper dive into that in the second lecture. There's a colophon, meaning a note by the scribe, noting his name, not on this folio, at the end of the manuscript, but for this reason we know that the dating of this manuscript was in 1008, 1009. Quite relatively soon after Sa'adia's passing, which was in the year 942. So this manuscript is considered our most faithful representation of Sa'adia's Tafsir. As you see, it's preserved in the Russian National Library in St. Petersburg. We will talk more about that collection in later lectures. Now, looking at this picture, this important text, leads us to questions and to the plan for today. So today's plan, we're going to talk about Sa'adia's milieu. Why did he need to write this translation? Why did it need to be copied and disseminated? What was the need for the translation of the Torah in Judeo-Arabic, in the Arabic language, Hebrew script? Then we're going to talk about Sa'adia as a revolutionary. The things that Sa'adia did, even the text you just saw in front of you, is a revolutionary act. And we're going to talk about what characterizes Sa'adia Gaon as a revolutionary in his time. And then I'm going to turn the tables on you, and we're going to talk about Sa'adia as a conservative, Sa'adia as a champion of rabbinic tradition. And in this Sa'adia is a window for us into the entire period. I'm focusing in on Rav Sa'adia, but I'm trying to illuminate for you the entire period of scholarship in Judeo-Arabic, the ways and means, and hopefully you will come out of this lecture with a real understanding of the period, in addition to an interest in Rav Sa'adia and my recommendations for further reading. So you're looking, we'll talk first about Sa'adia's milieu. The backdrop is a map that we're going to focus in on much more deeply in a second. I thank Hugh Kennedy personally from the School of Oriental and African Studies for allowing me to show his beautiful maps. So back to Sa'adia's Tafsir. So I'm now going to reveal to you something you may have already realized, which is that we are looking at verses from the portion of the week, Noach, which I chose because we are recording in the beginning of the year, the beginning of the Jewish year, when we re-begin the reading of the Torah. And the question that is going to guide us in understanding Sa'adia's milieu is, who was the audience for this creation? Why does Sa'adia devote himself to translating the text of the Torah? What is the context and what is the need? And I'm going to do this introduction to Sa'adia's milieu relatively briefly because I treated it in depth in the previous series on Judeo-Arabic. So we can feel Sa'adia's milieu via what he writes. And I'm going to read to you now from Sa'adia's own preface to his translation. This is my English translation from his Judeo-Arabic original, which was discovered by my teacher and my mentor, Chagai ben Shammai, and published in an article in Hebrew. So this is an English translation of Sa'adia's introduction as discovered by Chagai ben Shammai. So Sa'adia says the following: while I was living in my hometown, by the way, it was Dilas, Egypt, not a big city, I had long intended to compose for those of our religion a translated version of the Pentateuch, an appropriate one, and one which would accord with rational speculation as well as with rabbinic tradition. However, I hesitated to take this on, fearing to display my inner beliefs in public, for I imagined that in faraway places distant from my hometown, there existed clear and apt translations. So what do we feel from this personal introduction? And I should note that personal introductions are a feature of this period. Authors wrote in a personal way. This is the first time that we find in a mass sense in Jewish culture authors who refer to themselves as I, or sometimes we. They speak about their personal motivation. This is new. This is something that I discussed more in the earlier series, so I won't talk about it too much now, but you can notice all of these themes of authorship appearing in Sa'adia's preface. Sa'adia says that he realizes that there was a need for the translation of the Torah. He is assuming that the translation needs to happen in Arabic, which we actually know from other sources. So there are sources prior to Sa'adia's time period in which we hear from communities that they are no longer able to manage either the difficult biblical Hebrew or what has now become a difficult Aramaic Targum or Tarjum. The Onkelus's Aramaic translation is no longer enough for them. These communities need Jewish sources in Arabic. Other aspects of this preface we'll deal with in a second. So the backdrop to the need for Sa'adia's translation of the Torah into Arabic is, of course, the rise of Islam. Islam arises as a religion in the early 600s. By the late 7th century, has grown to become an empire, encompassing the area that you see on the map in front of you, encircled in red. This map is Hugh Kennedy's map of the Abbasid Caliphate, which was founded in the year 750, and which, as you can see, encompasses large aspects of today's Middle East, large sections of North Africa, large sections, not all, of the Iberian Peninsula. The important thing for understanding the background of Saadia's translation is what this meant for Jews. So this was a fascinating phenomenon for world history. For today, we focus on what it meant for Jews. So what it meant for Jews, and here I'm using the map of Eli Barnavi, which is a wonderful survey of Jewish communities of this area that had become Islamic ruled. The Islamic empire that you saw on the previous map encompassed the majority of the Jewish communities of the world. So what was the significance of this? I mean, you might say to me, empires always change. Jews have always been, moved from empire to empire. I mean, here they didn't move, here they stayed put, and the empire changed. But this had significant ramifications for the Jews of this area, and therefore the majority of Jews in the world. The first was linguistic. In the 7th century, as the Muslim religion spread, the armies brought with them Arabic. Within a few generations, and we know this from documentary and literary sources, the majority of the Jews of the world living in this area had become native Arabic speakers. So Arabic was now their native language, replacing Aramaic, Hebrew, Latin, Greek. Arabic had become the lingua franca of the region. Moreover, the Jews found themselves under a single political entity. So this meant that a Jew living in North Africa and a Jew living in areas that one would have called Persia, all the way in the east, or even all the way to India, were now united under a single political unit, meaning that these Jewish communities could be in better contact with each other. They had a shared language. They were in better contact now. And this is the final important point, they were living in the intellectual center of the world. Arabic became, for a variety of reasons, in the 8th and 9th centuries, the language of scholarship, the language in which treasures of earlier Greek civilization, earlier works from Sanskrit, earlier works from Persian, had undergone a wave of translations. If you wanted to read about nearly any field, you would do so in Arabic in these centuries following the rise of Islam. For this reason, the average Jewish scholar, and Saadia was of course far from average, but in the 8th and 9th centuries, had access to huge bodies of knowledge in Arabic. Not only did the scholars have access to these bodies of knowledge in Arabic, so did your everyday person. So we must envision a Jewish communities in the 8th and 9th centuries, for example, in this map in front of you, where if you wanted to read a book or if you wanted to learn a field, you had access to an incredible variety of fields in Arabic. This meant, why should you limit yourself to Jewish sources? Why should you learn Torah and Midrash and Talmud if you could read philosophy and theology and meteorology and astronomy, rhetoric? You could read all of this in Arabic. For this reason, a leader, as I said, he was Saadia Gaon. He was a leader in the Rabbinic Academy of Babylonia. He was the leader of the religious Jewish community. The Gaon was considered the intellectual leader of Jews from east to west, of the entire Jewish world. For this reason, in order to speak to this newly cosmopolitan audience, Saadia needed to innovate. And for this reason, I've decided that the first, it's really the second, following this introduction, the second section of this lecture will discuss Saadia as a revolutionary. Saadia as someone who needed to innovate in order to be able to speak to this newly cosmopolitan audience of Arabic-speaking Jews, and And we will now understand his incredible innovations and revolutions, which really have shaped the Jewish bookshelf until today. When I choose the term conservative, revolutionary, I am following my teacher and colleague, Professor Robert Brody of the Hebrew University, whose book I will highlight at the end of this lecture. But Professor Brody was the one who came up with the term the conservative revolutionary or the revolutionary conservative to describe Rabbi Sa. So really in shaping this lecture in this way, I'm led by Professor Brody's terminology. So the image that you're looking at is a copy of the Sidur of Rabbi Sa'adia's. It's a fragment which was preserved in what is known as the Cairo Geniza, the Ben Ezra synagogue in Cairo, which I will speak about a little more later on in this series. Why do I choose this image as exemplifying Sa'adia's revolution? Well, this is because a Sidur is obviously something that is traditional. It has the liturgy in it. The liturgy is sourced from the Talmud. It's something that Jews have been doing for a long time. Sa'adia was not an innovator, certainly not, in the liturgy. But what Sa'adia did when he composed his Sidur, he did something very new. He made it also an independent legal work. He included halachot about prayer. So his Sidur is not like the Sidur that many of us would encounter in the synagogue today, where it's liturgy and you know what prayers to say and you have the Amidah and the Birkot HaShachar and all of these. No, Sa'adia also included rules and ways in which one must pray, rules governing prayer. That is, he took a traditional body of texts and rendered them in a revolutionary way. So that's why I have chosen this fragment as an introduction to this section. Okay, now I want to focus in on particular revolutions in Sa'adia's work, and we're going to do so via looking at a number of exemplary compositions. So first of all, I want to talk about the fact that Sa'adia translated the Torah into Arabic, and the fact that he chose to write in Arabic at all. And what you must understand is that when Sa'adia arrived in Baghdad, as a youngish man, having, as I said, been born in Egypt and traveled through the land of Israel, where he also did some learning and probably did a lot of work relating to the Hebrew language. When Sa'adia came to the world of the yeshivot in Baghdad, by the way, the capital of the Abbasid Empire that we mentioned, Aramaic was considered the appropriate language for teaching, the appropriate language for writing, the appropriate language, by the way, for discussion in the yeshivot. All of this while we are talking about a community and communities who were, like I said, native Arabic speakers. And we hear from around the yeshivot, not from within the yeshivot, but from around them, this need for rendering Jewish sources in Arabic. Your average everyday Jew no longer feels comfortable in Aramaic, that's for sure. And the yeshivot are preserving Aramaic as a traditional way of teaching about Judaism. Sa'adia's decision to translate the Torah into Arabic overturned the ruling of an earlier Gaon who had said, no, I am not going to, you may not have a translation of the Torah into Arabic when asked by Jewish communities. Sa'adia himself, as a leader, produced the translation. We do know that he produced the translation on the basis of earlier, less canonical existing translations. So we do have evidence of earlier Judeo-Arabic translations, nothing that achieved canonicity as widely and as quickly as Sa'adia's translation. So first of all, simply the idea that I will render the Torah in Arabic, this will be an authoritative thing, was a revolutionary decision. The second is something that can be seen in this quote. Saadia says, not only is he going to create a translation, it will accord both with rational speculation as well as with rabbinic tradition. So we see here Saadia's double commitment. Rational speculation. So rational speculation is very much a feature of the period. It is a rational era. The new worlds of learning, all for Islam, Judaism, Christianity, and other religions, are highly based on the concept of rational thought. One may no longer say, oh, I'm only basing myself on tradition. No, no, no. The considerations of many theologians centered the idea of the importance of rational speculation. You judge something with your rational mind, your aql, okay? Saadia says that when he creates this translation, he wants it to accord with this area, nadar, this idea of rational speculation. And of course, it must also accord with rabbinic tradition. So in the idea that he has to translate in accordance with contemporary norms and theological concepts, Saadia is also revolutionary. Second of all, I want to show you how he did it. So it's not just the fact that he translated the Torah into Arabic. It is not just the fact that he wanted to accord with rational thought. Saadia's method, the bits and pieces of it, which we're going to dive into, don't be scared, I will lead you in the Judeo-Arabic, was absolutely revolutionary. So I will move you through now the Hebrew and the Judeo-Arabic, and I promise to make it understandable to all. So we're looking at, as I said, something appropriate to the beginning of the Jewish year, Parashat Noach, the portion of the week Noach. So we start out with the verse, Vayoled Noach Shelosha banim et Shem et Cham ve'et Yafet. Noach bore 3 sons, or Noach had 3 sons, Shem, Cham, and Yafet. So you may notice, I'm going to show you how Saadia renders this in Arabic. Here it is, sorry, let me go back a second. What Saadia does is he says, Aulada thalatha banin. He sired or gave birth to 3 sons. Wait a minute, what happened to the name Noach? So what Saadia dares to do when he translates the biblical text, and by the way, Onkelos did not do so in his Aramaic translation of the Torah, certainly not, Saadia omits repetitions. So we already knew about Noach from the previous verse. Noach ish tamim tzadik haya bedorotav. Noach was a righteous man. And therefore, when the verse says, and Noach sired 3 sons, I don't need that Noach. He took it out. And you can see, actually, if you look carefully, that somebody was uncomfortable with that and actually wrote it in on the manuscript. So I've circled it here, Noach. Some later reader wrote it in because they actually didn't feel comfortable with the fact that Saadia had omitted this seeming repetition. So this is revolutionary. I mean, the text of the Torah, Saadia and his contemporaries certainly conceived of it as the Word of God. And when you translate, you're omitting a word from the Word of God. I mean, the Midrash says that every letter, even the crowns on the letters, must be explained. So he skipped. So he does something similar later in the next verse. So we have the verse, Vatishachet haaretz lifnei haElohim, vatimale haaretz chamatz. The earth, a metaphor for people, became corrupted before God, and the earth was full of corruption. So what does Saadia do there? He omits the second occurrence of the word haaretz. And you can see it there in the Judeo-Arabic, which, by the way, is also written in a beautiful monumental square Hebrew script. This is a stunningly beautiful manuscript. وَإِذْ انْفَسَدَتْ الْأَرْض وَامْتَلَتْ ظَلْمًا. Okay, so al-ard is the Arabic for haaretz, the land, and you will notice that Sa'adia skips it in the second verse, and in the second half of the verse. And I will note that there's something very poetic about the original Hebrew here. Vatishachet haaretz lifnei Elohim, vatimaleh haaretz chamas. It's sort of almost a biblical parallelism. Sa'adia decides that he can lose that. He wants to avoid the repetition. And then you can see another example. Vayar Elohim, God saw the land and it was corrupted. Okay, the next verse. What does Sa'adia do? Wara'aha id infesadat. He saw it, that it had become corrupted. So he simply removes the word Elohim, the word for the name of God, and he replaces it by a pronoun. So this is a somewhat linguistic technical discussion, and I will save any further linguistic technical points for my students at the university or people who want the linguistic stuff. But the important thing to note here is that no one dared to do this to the biblical text, to the text of the Pentateuch, before Sa'adia. So Sa'adia creates a translation which is not a word-for-word translation. He has said it has to agree with rational speculation, so clearly he's going to change certain things. This is a promo to us that he's going to do that. And as I've shown you here, he has no qualms about removing repetition, about switching nouns with pronouns, and many other changes that he makes when he translates the biblical text. This text quickly became the canonical translation of the Torah, serving Arabic-speaking communities from Sa'adia's time until nearly today, with certain variations, which would be the topic for a later discussion. I will note that also when we talk about Judeo-Arabic and how Jews rendered the Arabic language in Hebrew letters, Sa'adia's Tafsir, his translation of the Torah, was one of the classic texts that set how one renders Arabic in Hebrew letters. So it had that function as well. Okay, the next revolution that I want to discuss has to do with genre. What you're looking at here is another fragment that was preserved in the Cairo Geniza, probably from the Ben Ezra synagogue, a fragment of Sa'adia's commentary on the book of Leviticus, on Vayikra. So why is that new? You might say to me, well, commentary on the Bible, that's the most ancient field, isn't it? We even have commentary within the Bible about the Bible. How is that new? The entire field of Bible commentary underwent a revolution during Sa'adia's period. Earlier commentaries were entirely different than the type of commentary we find in Judeo-Arabic. I discussed in the earlier series, I devoted an entire lecture to the idea of centering the Bible. The idea of centering the Bible was new. Jewish tradition and Jewish scholarship prior to the period of Sa'adia was focused on law, was focused on the Talmud, explaining the Talmud and explaining Jewish law. Around Sa'adia's time period, the Bible was recentered. The idea of writing about the Bible, dictionaries of the Bible, books of commandments centered on the Bible, and of course, Bible commentary. So the list that I've put in front of you reflects the books that we are certain that Sa'adia commented on. About certain books, there are questions. This has to do with topics that I will raise in the third lecture in this series, when I will talk about what happened when people stopped writing scholarly works in Judeo-Arabic, when Judeo-Arabic ceased to be the default language of scholarship. So this is related to the question of why We are not always entirely sure which books of the Bible Saadia commented on. But in any case, you can see that he commented on 3 of the books of the Torah, the book of Isaiah, Psalms and Proverbs, books that were in daily use, the book of Job, the book of Daniel, and perhaps there were others. We're not exactly sure. So the fact that Saadia decided to take up the field of Bible commentary, to write verse-by-verse commentaries in Judeo-Arabic on biblical books, and by the way, he normally accompanied each commentary with a translation. So, for example, the book of Psalms, 150 Psalms, includes Judeo-Arabic translation and Judeo-Arabic commentary on the Psalms. Saadia was the first of the Gaonim, the first of these leaders of the Babylonian academies to do so. In choosing to center the Bible, by the way, as part of a growing movement in his period, Saadia set the tone for Gaonim after him. And many of them continued the tradition of writing commentary in Judeo-Arabic on the Bible. So this was new, the idea of a single authored Bible commentary that went verse by verse and that strived to explain biblical books in their context with linguistic observations. This was new. This was a revolutionary choice on Saadia's part. Another new genre that Saadia innovated was the idea of writing a grammar book of biblical Hebrew. So you're looking at the edition that was created by Aaron Dotan of blessed memory, who taught at Tel Aviv University. Saadia called his book Kitab Fasih Lughat al-Ibraniyin, the book of the eloquence of the language of the Hebrews. And you can see that in its Hebrew translation here by Aaron Dotan. Saadia wrote this grammar, talked about the way words were put together, morphology of words in biblical Hebrew. He talked about biblical syntax. In this way, he was one of the first to write a grammar examining the way biblical Hebrew was put together. One should also consider that Jews were particularly well placed to write grammars of Semitic languages. Jews as familiar with 3 Semitic languages, native speakers of Arabic, and obviously readers of Arabic, with deep knowledge of Hebrew and deep knowledge of Aramaic. So in the field of comparative linguistics in the 8th and 9th century, Jews were incredibly well positioned. And by the way, this is not the only work of grammar and comparative linguistics that was created in Judeo-Arabic. So Saadia's choice to take up the genre of writing a synthetic grammar of biblical Hebrew was revolutionary. Other scholars around him did do the same. So he was not the only one to write a grammar, but the idea of creating this kind of outward look at the Bible, a guide to the language of the Bible, was highly new in his period, and he was the first rabbinite, actually, to do so, the first Talmudic Jew to do so. And the final revolutionary aspect of Saadia's work that I want to discuss is the idea of independent legal monographs. So, as I have said, the scholarly culture of the Jewish world prior to Rav Saadia's time was one, or at least in the rabbinic yeshivot, was one that was focused on the legal. Legal genres were of great interest. The explanation of the Talmud, the writing of additional works that had been a feature of earlier centuries, basically following the order of the Talmud, anonymous works. What you are looking at is Saadia's work called Kitab al-Shahadat wal-Wathaiq, the book of deeds and documents. a book that Saadia wrote for judges, a manual for judges who needed to write legal documents. This particular copy was preserved in the Cairo Geniza. It's dated in a scribal colophon to the year 1107. And I bring this in order to illuminate a broader subject, which is the idea of writing single-authored monographs, a single book written by a single author devoted to a particular subject. This was new in Saadia's period. Legal works prior to Saadia were either following the order of the Talmud, which really isn't an order, or were anonymous in many cases. Saadia was the first of the leaders of the yeshivot of Babylon, the first of the leaders of the Jewish scholarly community to devote monographs to specific halachic legal topics. So now, if you wanted to learn, for example, as in this example, about how to write a shtar, how to write a document, a wathiqa, as he calls it, you wouldn't need to, go to indices of the Talmud or leaf through the Talmud itself or go through responsa literature. No, you could go to a single monograph in order to learn what you needed to know about the topic. So it's an organization of knowledge that did not exist before, obviously, in Judeo-Arabic. Every single one of these legal monograph, single-authored works was written in Judeo-Arabic. The majority of Saadia's writing was in Judeo-Arabic. And later Gaonim, later leaders of the Jewish community, followed Rav Saadia. So for example, Rav Shmuel ben Chofni Gaon wrote a variety of legal monographs, just like Saadia did. Rashbach wrote about tzitzit. He wrote about maturity, when you reach bar mitzvah age or bat mitzvah age. He wrote about divorce, talaq. And you can find Saadia and later Gaonim during the period of composition in Judeo-Arabic, devoting themselves to these single subject monographs. So this was the final revolutionary aspect that I want to treat today. On the other hand, Saadia was a revolutionary in the service of tradition. And now I want to present the other side of things. I want to show you how, even when writing in Judeo-Arabic, even when composing in revolutionary genres, Saadia was championing tradition, and how he interwove traditional sources into his revolutionary framing of Judeo-Arabic or of genres. So I want to show you the other side of things. So we can look at, for example, Saadia's commentary on Genesis. So as you remember from the slide on Saadia's Bible commentary, he commented on the first half of the book of Genesis. So I bring you, this actually happens to also be from Noach by chance, but we can stay with Parashat Noach for this lecture. So the verse says, "V'hakimoti et beriti itach, uvata el hateva, ata uvanecha ve'ishtecha unshei vanecha itach." So thou shalt come into the ark, thou and thy sons, and thy wife and thy sons' wives with thee. And Saadia is going to focus on the second half of this verse. So what does Saadia say? And this is my translation of the Judeo-Arabic edition created by Moshe Tzuker, the scholar of Judeo-Arabic literature. It is said, regarding the grouping together of the men in the verse, you and your sons with you, and the grouping of the women together in the phrase, and your wife and your sons' wives, that he warned them to stay separate during their time in the ark. This is a likely interpretation. Okay, so this is Saadia in Judeo-Arabic explaining the particularities of the verse. So you remember in the verse, thou and thy sons, and thy wife and thy sons' wives. So what this what Saadia, I gave it away, what Saadia's explanation is saying, it is said, so he's quoting anonymously from another source, we don't know what source, that men and women were meant to be separate in the ark, apparently. And we know this because when God told Noah to go in, he first mentioned the men, and then he mentioned the women. So this is actually a rabbinic source. It's found, for example, in the Talmud, in Sanhedrin. I'll read it. I'll read the source, which I brought here in a translation found on the Sefaria site. The Gemara asks, and from where do we derive that it was prohibited for them to engage in intercourse while in the ark? The Gemara answers, from that which is written, you and your sons, and your wife and your sons' wives. And the Talmud actually brings the verse at the end of the flood story, which actually is the important clincher for this explanation, because then it says, emerge from the ark, you and your wife, and your sons' wives. So men and women are no longer separate, men and women are together. So this is a source. So the important thing in looking at Saadia's rendering, notice, first of all, Saadia does so anonymously. This is not because he doesn't want to quote the Talmud or because he thinks he needs to hide that it's from the Talmud, but rather because this was the custom in the period. Judeo-Arabic Bible commentary of the 10th century, whether written by Saadia or whether written by others, quotes sources anonymously. You didn't pester your reader with a lot of sources and attributions. Notice that Saadia is approving of this source. This is a likely interpretation. And notice, and this is the most important aspect of this conservative revolution, is that Saadia is rendering a traditional rabbinic source, which is found in the Talmud in Aramaic, an Aramaic explanation of a biblical Hebrew phrase. Here it's rendered in pure Judeo-Arabic, besides the quotation of the Hebrew, which Saadia does normally quote in the biblical Hebrew. The envelope, the framing of this explanation is entirely in Judeo-Arabic. It would have been transparent, clear to his audience. An audience that was not familiar with the Talmud would not have known that this explanation came from the Talmud. So what Saadia is doing is mediating traditional rabbinic literature in Judeo-Arabic to this cosmopolitan audience of Baghdad. And I should note that my teacher and mentor, Chagai Ben Shammai, emeritus of the Hebrew University, wrote an entire article on this topic. And he notes there how difficult it was to unearth the rabbinic explanations that underlie Saadia's Judeo-Arabic renderings, because you can barely feel, you can't feel that it's a traditional rabbinic translation, rabbinic explanation translated from Aramaic into Judeo-Arabic. Saadia's commentary is so smooth, and as you know from the previous section of the lecture, he was also committed to rational speculation. So it feels cosmopolitan. It feels like the Arabic you would read in contemporary philosophy, theology. However, it's rendering rabbinic sources. So Saadia's revolution was in the service of tradition. The next example I want to bring of Saadia's service of tradition has to do with the way Saadia structures traditional material. So the book you're looking at here is a Geniza fragment. By the way, I should mention that this fragment is from the Cambridge University Library, as are many of the other fragments, as you'll see on each screen. And I'm grateful to the Cambridge University Library and Ben Outhwaite for giving me permission to show these images. So you're looking at Saadia's book of bailments, Kitab al-Wadi'a. Ahkam al-Wadi'a, Kitab Ahkam al-Wadi'a, the book of laws having to do with bailments, meaning pawning, exchange of goods between people, which doesn't have to do with ownership. So this is the final page. You can see, by the way, from the end, which is one of the examples of a scribal colophon, which I discussed before. It says, Kamulat ahkam al-wadi'a. This is the end of the laws of bailments, and ending the book. On the one hand, this type of legal monograph, which I discussed in the previous section as a revolution. One can also look at it as a championing of tradition. Sa'adia is taking classical rabbinic material, a classical rabbinic subject, the idea of what's called in Hebrew pikdonot, or pawns, moving objects between people, and the incredibly complicated laws governing this. And he renders it in Judeo-Arabic in a book that's devoted to the subject. So on the one hand, we have a new genre, the monograph. The outer form is similar to the types of books that everybody would be writing in Arabic. Single authored, there's titles, there's chapters, there's introductions in a particular Arabic style. On the other hand, Sa'adia is anchoring traditional legal interpretations within this outer contemporaneous framework. Okay, so this is Sa'adia in a revolutionary way, championing tradition. Another example of Sa'adia's championing of tradition has to do with his struggle against the Karaites. And the Karaites are a group I treated in the previous set of lectures. I'm going to look at it in a different way this time. So here you're going to see Sa'adia's active polemic on behalf of tradition. Here, not within Talmudic-centered Judaism, as we saw before, but here within the broader Jewish community, contending with other groups within this broader Jewish community. So the Karaites are a group within the Jewish community, and I'm going to take a small detour just to introduce who they are, and then we're going to talk about how Sa'adia is a champion of tradition when facing the Karaites. So the image that I chose for this section of the lecture, you see it's a somewhat damaged fragment from the Cairo Geniza, but it's a fascinating one. It's Sa'adia's Kitab al-Sab'in Lafza, his book of 70 words. It's an early copy on the basis of the script. What is the book of 70 words? It's 70 plus minus words in the Bible that cannot be explained without recourse to rabbinic texts. So it was Sa'adia's linguistic work, but on the other hand, this is a work that has been discussed as one that could have a polemical bent. To say to non-Talmudic Jews, i.e. Karaites and others, well, you know what? You need rabbinic sources to understand our most central text, the Bible. You cannot understand the Bible without rabbinic tradition. So I bring this to you just as sort of helping us enter the field of Sa'adia's polemic with the Karaites. Now, a brief introduction to Karaites. You're looking at a Karaite ketubah from the early 12th century. It's in Hebrew. If you zoom in close, you'll see that it's in Hebrew. Karaite ketubot were in Hebrew, not in Aramaic. Karaitism was an energetic new movement within Judaism, developing during the 8th and 9th centuries. I, as a scholar of Judeo-Arabic, do a lot of work with Karaite sources. The Karaite movement was one of the major reasons for the innovations of Judeo-Arabic, which we are touching on in this lecture. So you're looking at a ketubah, and I'll just read from 2 lines in it, which perhaps you'll be able to zoom in on and see, but I'll read them in English translation. And our elder, dear Yahya, also a Jewish name in the period, stipulated according to his will and resolve that he shall come into the covenant of the Lord pardon that typo, blessed be his name, and that he shall not profane against his aforementioned wife. I should say that the husband is a Rabbinite Jew, a Talmudic-oriented Jew, and the wife in this ketubah is a Karaite. So he shall not profane the festivals of the Lord according to the sighting of the moon. Calendar was a main issue of contention between Karaite Judaism and Rabbinite Judaism. Rabbinites used calculation to calculate the calendar. Karaites used the sighting of the moon yet during this period. And that he shall not light the Sabbath candles against her. Rabbinites light Sabbath candles, Karaites don't. And not force her in her food and drink. There are some different laws of kashrut, etc. So this is just to show you Karaite Judaism and Rabbinite Judaism are intertwined at this time. There are marriages. They're both parts of the same Jewish community. So Karaism is a group that arose during the 8th and 9th centuries. They were scripturalists. They did not accept the Talmud as a Torah that was given at Sinai. They said, we'll judge it. If we find things that are rational, we'll accept them, and if not, no. So they based themselves on the Mikra, Karaite Mikra, on the Torah, on the Bible. They were innovators because they were less beholden to rabbinic tradition. They could do new things, perhaps in lighter ways. Saadia was, of course, an innovator, as you've seen, but the Karaites as a whole could also be innovators. Prolific composition, first in Hebrew and then in Judeo-Arabic in the period under discussion, and quite successful politically in the areas in which they lived, and mixed marriages, as you've seen here, a different calendar. So to demonstrate the intertwinedness of the communities, we have also among the documentary finds of the Cairo Geniza, which of course we'll talk more about in the second lecture of this series, permission for Rabbinite Jews to buy cheese produced by a Karaite Jew. The permission is given in Egypt. The Karaite Jew is in the land of Israel from mid-11th century Egypt. And Karaite communities, just to give you an idea of their spread, we believe that Karaism began in the East in the 8th and 9th centuries in Persian-speaking areas. They created a significant community in Jerusalem in the 10th and 11th centuries, and I treat that in detail in other Beit Avichai series. There was a large community, an influential community in Egypt, which is the source of the documents that I just showed you, a quite influential community in today's Istanbul, then Constantinople, and of course then an Eastern European Karaite community that formed, and that was, we hear a lot from, and I will be treating in upcoming lectures one of the important figures in the 19th century of this of this Eastern European Karaite community, Avraham Firkovich, but that's for later on. But just to give you on one foot, Karaite communities, and this is one of their most important synagogues in Cairo, which was active till the mid-20th century, the Moshe Darai synagogue, which, by the way, has a replica in Ashdod today. So Karaites had a very long history in the Middle East and in Egypt in particular. So now back to the theme of Saadia as a champion of tradition. What I'm showing you here was a polemic, an explicit polemic that Saadia wrote against a Karaite contemporary named Ibn Sakhaway. And here I base myself on the research of my colleague and friend, Dr. Nadia Vidro, who is active in the UK. So whereas in the first image, I showed you Saadia's book of 70 words, where we feel that this may be a polemic against Karaites, here it's a head-on polemic. The refutation of the unfair attacker on the Mishnah and the Talmud in Arabic, in its original, Kitab al-Rad al-Mutahamil al-Mishnah wa Talmud. So it's a polemic about all of the classic issues of contention, between Rabbinite Jews and Karaite Jews, calendar and festivals, forbidden foods, is tradition valid, laws of marriage, ritual purity, Sabbath law, things like this. Saadia wrote nearly a dozen polemics against the Karaites. His Bible commentary is also full of polemic against Karaites. For us, this is part of Saadia as a champion of tradition. So you see, it's not just that he's trying to speak to a contemporary audience and make rabbinic tradition available in Judeo-Arabic in a way that makes sense to them. He is also explicitly defending rabbinic tradition against Karaite Jews. So the final example that I want to bring, and something which will be a promo for the third lecture in this series, is Saadia's view of Hebrew. So like I said, nearly all of Saadia's works were composed in Judeo-Arabic. One of the few works that he composed in Hebrew, and he had a beautiful Hebrew, was the work that he composed when he was 20, called the Egron Compendium. Egron comes from the Hebrew root agar, to collect. The compendium. This was a dictionary. A dictionary for poets. That's what he explains. It has a prologue. It has a dictionary that goes in the order of Aleph, Bet, Gimel. And then finally, a section that goes in order of rhymes to help poets who are writing poetic works in Hebrew. This is a championing of the Hebrew language, and now I'm going to show you why. So what you're looking at is Nehemiah Aloni, of blessed memory, his edition of the Egron, which had a Hebrew preface and had a Judeo-Arabic preface. So here you can see this has full vocalization and biblical cantillation marks. So just notice that about the Hebrew. And now I'm going to bring you, this is the translation of Robert Brody. So the compendium of the Holy Tongue, this is how he began his preface, which God chose from time eternal and in which the angels praise him. One language and unique words in all the land from the time of creation of humans upon earth. So notice that this is a classic statement from the period. If I were talking to a Muslim theologian, he would say in the Garden of Eden they spoke Arabic. A Christian would tell me they spoke Syriac. Saadia, of course, thinks that they spoke Hebrew, and he has proofs, right? He has verses from Genesis, by the way, that can prove that Hebrew was the language of the Garden of Eden. Why is Saadia creating the Egron? We are bereft of the stronghold of our holy speech, and all the visions of its prophecies and its speeches are like a sealed book to us. And in waking from a vision, we stumble in our language in the lands of our captivity, i.e., Saadia, this person who has devoted himself to teaching about Jewish tradition in Arabic, in Judeo-Arabic, for he's a native Arabic speaker. He speaks Arabic like Egyptians today. I'm convinced of it. He's from Egypt. He is deploring the loss of Hebrew. Jews don't know Hebrew well enough in the early 10th century. So what does he say? The collector, Saadia, wrote this book at age 20 to serve as a source of wisdom for all the people of God. And he prepared it to teach them to riddle riddles, lachud chidot, and to speak in parallels, mishalim, and to write works of all kinds and to rhyme every rhyme. The people of God will use it daily. I mean, he has this vision here. And remember, he's writing in biblical Hebrew. He uses a biblical register and with cantillation marks. And he was criticized for this, by the way. Who do you think you are, a prophet? But a vision of Hebrew as the language of the Jews. So this, I end our lecture today with this to give you a feeling of a world in which Arabic is the native language, Arabic is the scholarly language of Jews, but in which Jews are still committed to Hebrew, and we will explore this dichotomy more in the third lecture. So to sum up, today I presented to you an introduction to the use of Judeo-Arabic for scholarly works via a focus in on the figure of Sa'adia Gaon, 862 to 942. This ushered in a period in which, 882 to 942. This ushered in a period in which the default language for scholarship was Arabic, Judeo-Arabic, which I'll talk about more in the next sections. For now, you saw it's Arabic in Hebrew script. And I presented to you Sa'adia as a revolutionary and a conservative at the same time. And finally, we've raised a question regarding Hebrew and Arabic as coexisting. If Arabic is the spoken language of the majority of the Jews in the world, and it's the language of Jewish scholarship as well, what is the role of Hebrew? And we will discuss this in lecture number 3. And finally, I just want to leave you with some recommendations for further reading. I highly recommend the book devoted to Rav Sa'adia by my colleague and mentor, Professor Robert Brody of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Eminently readable book. And if you have questions after this lecture, you can write me, but you can also read Professor Brody's book. So thank you very much for listening.